Yes, so again, my name's Azamat, and indeed, as Tiona said, I'm working as a data scientist. So I have a little bit more of a technical background, but this talk is going to be also for the wider audience, and I'll be talking on the same topic, but as directly covered, but from a little bit of a different angle and perspective. And I want to share with you today how recommender systems work. And if you don't know what recommender systems are, it's a class of algorithms that essentially powers a lot of services that we use today. And I'll show you some examples of the services and the companies that use them later. But first, I want to start with a little story to make it more relatable. But how exactly recommender systems work and how do we personalize content in the digital services today? So let's imagine that you have a conversation with a friend. You're just texting. It's late on a Saturday, and your friend wants to watch something on Netflix, and she ran out of shows to watch. So she asked you to give some kind of recommendation. Um, your natural response is to try to figure out, okay, what is my friend's preferences overall, if you don't know them yet. So you can get that information by asking a simple question: what kind of shows do you like? And then your friend can tell you that, for instance, she watched recently Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad and really loved it, right? And that's kind of how naturally this conversation would go. And then your response might be, okay, so first I can think of some similar shows that I know, similar to Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad. So in this case, let's say it's two other shows, The Witcher and Narcos. And coincidentally, they're also both available on Netflix, so really cool, blah, blah, blah. But let's imagine that you actually didn't like The Witcher and Narcos yourself. So you don't really want to recommend those two shows, and rather you would recommend her something that you enjoyed much more recently, and that's a series called Mr. Robot. When you look on the surface of it, Mr. Robot, Game of Thrones, and Breaking Bad are not that similar. But you, from your gut feeling and also knowing that it seems like you have similar tastes in shows, you will go for the second recommendation rather than the first two. Then your friend thanks you. Hopefully she'll check it out, and she might even give you feedback on how much she liked that show or not. So what had just happened? We had a task of making a personalized recommendation because we got a request. Okay, our friend wants to know something, and our friend is a unique person with unique preferences, right? All people are different. So the first approach that we thought of was to recommend similar movies, similar shows. So what would it be here? The Witcher would be similar to Game of Thrones because they're both fantasy action series and they're both set in medieval times. So to a computer, those would seem different because they check all the marks on, a few of the dimensions of how can you describe TV series. And then the same for Breaking Bad. Both of the shows are crime dramas about drug lords. So again, on the surface, just from the textual description, it seems like their shows are similar, and therefore it's kind of logical to recommend similar shows as well. This is content-based recommendation, and these kind of algorithms are actually quite widespread still, and they really work in situations where you don't really have a lot of data, but they're also quite limited because when you think about it, if you can only recommend similar shows, then first of all, you can't really take into account the combination of the preferences. And second of all, you're not really doing personalization because you will recommend The Witcher to everyone who watched Game of Thrones, regardless of anything else that you know about them. Therefore, there's another family of approaches of how to do it that has become more and more used and relevant, and that's something that works a little bit differently. And on this slide, I want to show you the logic of how it works. And this table might seem a little bit complicated at first, but think back to the example that we had and to the conversation, right? We heard that Egle likes Game of Thrones and Breaking Bad, and we realized that Egle and me we have similar tastes in shows. And then I think of, oh, okay, I have this other friend who also watched those two movies, and he also actually really liked Mr. Robot and recommended that to me as well. So what you have here is a preference matrix, and this is actually how a lot of data about our interactions on the web and digital services is stored. And the idea is that for me, in this database, we know that I have watched and liked those three shows, and then for my other friends as well. For Egle, we know that she only watched two of those shows, and then there's, let's say, four possible options of what we can recommend. We can recommend Mr. Robot, Narcos, The Witcher, and How I Met Your Mother. So with content-based recommendation, we would recommend Narcos and The Witcher because they're similar. But from here, we would actually say that the most similar show is Mr. Robot, because if you look at the preferences of me and my friends, and because we have a similar preference profile to Egle, this is the most logical thing to recommend. And this is called collaborative recommendation or collaborative filtering. And when you think about it on the surface, it seems like there's quite some nuances that you lose, right? Because in this kind of recommendation, we don't know anything about the show Mr. Robot. We don't know what is it about. We don't know if it's action or drama or this or that. We only know that I liked it, my friend liked it, and Egle might like it because she liked things that I also liked. Despite the kind of intuitive simplicity of this and the seeming constraints in terms of how much data you use, this is really, really a powerful approach when you think to the scale of things that we're operating with. And I'll show a few examples of that as well. But so essentially, the idea for this talk today is to explain what recommender systems those algorithms are, which is try to start on, and then also show on some examples how they're used in business and how can they be specifically helpful to you as well, and in which cases are they essentially needed. And for myself, I'll skip that part because Tiona made a really, really nice and warm introduction. So we'll move on to the examples of recommender systems, what I promised on the first slide, and you can see them here. These are the biggest ones. So YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, Spotify, anytime you interact with any of these services, you are served some kind of recommendations, right? And we all know this from our personal experience, because whenever you log into or you open someone else's Netflix or YouTube page, right, they look very different from what you see on an everyday basis, because most of the content is actually personalized. And the same with Amazon. Whenever you start shopping something, or even if you just log into the homepage of Amazon, every one of us is going to see a different version of that web page. And that happens because of those recommender system algorithms. And when people say that those big tech companies, they have a lot of data about us and they know what we like and all of those things, it's not that they store all of this information about, oh, I am interested in this and this item is similar to something else. They mostly operate on this collaborative filtering domain, where essentially the idea is that you should just recommend something that was enjoyable to other people similar to me. So in YouTube, that would be any of the videos that you see, and in Netflix, some of the bars with the shows that you see are curated, but most of them are actually personalized. And to answer the question of why do we even need recommender systems and why do we need personalization, I think on the one hand, what Irakli showed about being relevant for your customers as the brands, as the brand holders, that's also a very important part of the aspect. But then, just on a pragmatical note, imagine using YouTube where nothing is personalized to you. There's a million hours of video uploaded on YouTube daily. And those statistics are often shown to just highlight the scale of data available right now. But if you think about it from a customer perspective, that scale of data means that we will never have in our lifetime enough hours to watch stuff on Netflix, on YouTube, on all of those services. So without those recommender systems, we would have not just decision fatigue where we can't decide what to watch, but we would just be lost. All this information would be completely unstructured, and yeah, it would be very, very difficult to find any kind of information. And for Netflix, this is probably less critical than for services like Amazon and YouTube. But when you think about it, it's not only applicable to the companies that really hold massive customer bases and serve, millions of different products like Amazon on a daily basis. This is a relevant problem for many, many different businesses. And on one of the next slides, I'll also have an example of which specifically. But to recap on how recommender systems work, we won't go into too much detail anymore because yeah, this is also not supposed to be a very technical talk, but if you will have any questions, I can answer them afterwards as well. But here you can see essentially the two main different ways of making recommendations: the collaborative filtering and the content-based filtering, which both have their pros and cons. And the pro of the collaborative filtering is essentially that it's much more personalized, and it is personalization in a sense what we imagine today. Whereas this content-based filtering, where you recommend similar products, that's very simple to make, but it's very generic because it doesn't take into account your preferences. And what does it mean to have a personalized experience for a digital business, which is most businesses today? It essentially means that if you have a relevant experience, your customer is more happy, right? He or she is more satisfied with using your website, your service, consuming articles on your media website. And in the end, that also has very important implications for your business because, well, all the different metrics will go in the right direction, in the direction you want them to. And your customers will essentially just be more likely to come back. And as Jonas said, this is almost becoming a necessity in today's world because we're flooded with so many different messages and advertisements and things to consume. And unless someone helps us to navigate this world, we're just going to stop using those services. And this is the responsibility of the digital services in the current world. And this is where the recommender systems essentially come in, because staying relevant is quite challenging even in the old world. But as customers are getting used to those personalized experiences, right? Because everyone has access to Amazon, everyone has access to even Google, YouTube. We are priming the customer to be used to this kind of seamless personalization where everything that he or she sees is really interesting for them. So recommender systems in one form or another are essentially becoming a necessity for today's world. And it's an interesting thing to also ponder on because while this technology may seem relatively simple, let's say simpler than some examples of generating language or generating images that you also often see when linked to AI, this is still a very big and very rapidly evolving field. So the recommender systems as a family of algorithms, it's not really established yet. There's still really things changing every day. And it's one of the great things about these kind of algorithms is that now they're really getting democratized, because let's say 10 years ago, only the big players could make use of them. Now it's possible for essentially any kind of business. And these are the three big categories that can benefit of businesses that can benefit from personalization. But obviously it applies to many more examples. These are just, let's say, the most straightforward ones and the ones that have the biggest incentive to start doing anything in the field of recommendation right now. And I think the biggest and the most important one is e-commerce, because essentially, even if you have a catalog of just 100 items, there's a nice possibility of you to cross-sell your products if you get a certain visit. And in the current world of essentially fast interactions where humans just spend 2 minutes on Instagram, then 5 minutes on Twitter, then they bounce to one website, then back and forth. This is really important. It's important to optimize every single interaction that your customer has with your service. So for e-commerce, regardless of how big your catalog is, it is important to personalize it in one form or another. And it can be something like one of those algorithms that I've described, but it can also just be some kind of business ruling. And I'm sure many digital businesses take that into account, but still it's a good reminder to be aware of also more powerful tools to bring a more personalized experience. And what I see less in today's world is personalization for digital media. And I think for digital media, this is actually maybe even more important than for e-commerce catalogs, because right now, most of the digital media, most of the online news websites, they publish something and they write those articles and they share them through Twitter and other social media. And after 3 or 4 days, those articles are gone, and most of them are gone forever, unless people will search for them in Google search, but those are usually very skewed towards some news articles and stuff like that. But a lot of the content that we write, unless it resurfaces in Google search, is lost forever, because people are not going to go on to the 6th page of your media website to find something that you've written 2 months ago. So personalization can really help you resurface some of the older content to your readers when they visit your website. So that's where it really shines as well. And I think much more can be utilized by journalists and content creators in this field. And finally, and I guess also most how it is mostly used today in businesses is digital marketing. And there, the definition of what is personalization really varies. And it can be things like optimizing audience selection or automating business rules, or it can be something on a much grander scale. And I'll present you in a few slides also what that grander scale might be. But yeah, these are the examples of the businesses that would essentially benefit a lot. So it sounds really cool, right? But building recommender systems is hard. And that's why I also on the previous slide said that sometimes if you can avoid building it with just thinking of a nice set of decision rules, a nice set of kind of understandings of the customers to recreate this, that's probably also a good approach in many cases, because there are some out-of-the-box solutions, especially on the big platforms, like for instance Shopify. If you open your web shop on there, there's a internal recommender system that you can use. You'll Justify and some other startups that offer out-of-the-box solutions, but they're really in their early days and they're not well integrated yet into all of the platforms that digital services use today, and probably also a bit expensive. The other alternative is to create them with ready-to-use packages, but that essentially involves a lot of technical knowledge, and you don't need AI researchers specifically to build a recommender system. That's something that a developer can do with the use of some ready-to-use packages. But if you want to make your recommender systems work well, then indeed you will need some expertise, a data scientist, a software engineer with experience in machine learning, something like that. And why is it hard? It's hard because we are modeling human behavior and human preferences. And just like human communication, this is something that's really tough to understand and to model. And it's due to several reasons. The first and the most obvious one is that human behavior and preferences, they change over time. Something that I liked and enjoyed 6 months ago, probably wouldn't even recognize it today. Another thing is that we cannot test human behavior on past data because of the fact that it changes over time. And for us as data scientists and people who are developing all of those things, that's really important limitation, because it means that we cannot test and experiment with these algorithms just on our computer with the data that we have. Every time we want to test or validate some of the ideas that we have, we need to reach out to the customers to essentially set up some of those, let's say, A/B experiments, which is, it's a very good thing and pace for the business, but it makes it much more challenging with regards to the modeling side. Finally, when you think of that table that you saw in the very beginning, that is essentially how we store that preference information. And when you think about the scale of how big this table becomes, even if you have just 1,000 users and 100 items, that's 100,000 numbers that you need to look at. And it's just numbers. It's not text that you can like pull out and read through some examples. It's not images that you can open on your laptop. So interpreting behavior is really challenging from raw numbers. And most of the time, you don't really understand what's happening inside of those algorithms. And finally, we don't actually have direct access to their preferences, because every time you watch something on Netflix, you don't say, okay, I rate this 5 stars and it was really awesome and it's the best movie I've ever seen. It derives, whether you liked it or not, from information like, okay, did you actually finish that movie? Or maybe you watched 10 minutes of it and then you left, which they can interpret as a signal. Oh, okay, you actually didn't like it, so we won't record it as you watching this, but as you disliking it, right? You're making a lot of assumptions about what human behavior and those customer journeys, how they translate into numbers. So because it's hard, we don't really know why or how essentially they work. But with personalization, I think it would be nice to, I think it's nice to think about it by drawing a parallel to how journalism and writing works. And I like this framework because I used to work as a journalist myself. So whenever you write a news article, you need to answer 6 big questions: who, what, when, where, how, and why. And essentially with recommender systems and personalization, you can do something for each of those questions that you ask with regards to the service that you offer and with regards to the customers that you serve, except for the why, because it's challenging to interpret what they do. But so what do you, who do you need to start building recommender systems or to start doing anything about personalization? You need users, and you need some kind of solution to store that data. And I think that's a prerequisite for any digital business, even if you don't want to build recommender systems. If you have users interacting with your website, with any of your services, you should store that data. If you're just letting it waste and go into oblivion, that's really, yeah, that's nothing really bad right now, but I think a few years from now, when personalization is going to really come into more and more places, that can be challenging. And a piece of advice here is store not just high-level metrics or metadata, but really store everything that you have. It might be expensive in the short run, but in the long run, it will pay off. So if you run any kind of digital business, you really need this right now. And once you have some of that information, you can start personalizing, you can start building those systems. And here it's important to find some kind of balance between the complexity of your solution, right? So how much effort essentially you're willing to spend on building this thing and making it work with regards to the added value, to how much essentially, yeah, how much can you increase your revenue if you have a higher CTR rate or a higher goal conversion? So it's important to keep those things in mind and not just jump at this thing because it's hot, because it's trendy. So it's still important to keep in mind those things. And then once you have built something and once you start seeing, okay, it really helps me and it really helps my use case, you can start moving forward and start doing more advanced forms of personalization, because the examples that we had before, right, that was just about recommending what. So Egle, my friend, wanted to see something and I had to come up with what that something is. But there's all kinds of other information and all kinds of other data that we can take into account when making a recommendation. And this is things like even what is the time of the day, what is the weather outside, because let's say if you have a short lunch break and you go on YouTube or you go on, let's say, TikTok, you don't have that much time. So you would rather recommend probably shorter things that the user is more likely to watch in full and complete. Then in the evening, where they sit down and they are ready to have a longer session and things like that. Same applies to e-commerce. So it's important to understand where your customer is, what time of the year it is, because yeah, if it's been a very rainy season and you start recommending umbrellas, I think it's these kind of things can seem kind of logical and small, but to really grasp all of them and to take into account all of the kinds of weather, kinds of day of time that exist, it's also quite challenging. So start moving here if you have the right talent, or experiment little by little with setting up some small experiments. Once you've mastered that part, and this is where things are getting a bit gray, because the where and the how is really where let's say most of the not just applications but the research and recommender systems is happening. So there's not a lot of consensus on what's the best practices here. But another thing is, let's say if you're a little bit of a bigger brands and you have interactions with customers across multiple channels and multiple touch points. So you serve them advertisements on Facebook, Gmail, the users consume your content on YouTube. You also have to know what to show where. And an example of this is BuzzFeed, which essentially has, I think, over 200 channels across which they can communicate some of the content that they create. And just figuring out what to put where is a really, really challenging question. So if you know enough about your users, not just on any single of those channels, but really across them, if you can build those user profiles, it would be wise to utilize that information and to start figuring out, okay, is something more applicable to show as a Google search ad, or maybe as a social media advertisement. And then finally, and that's one of my personal favorites in the field of what can we how can we personalize, is this example. So again, as you probably mentioned, I'm mentioning a lot of Netflix. That's because they are, I guess, the big player in recommender systems, and they produce a lot of the insights on how to build them properly. And another thing that you might have noticed from comparing your Netflix page to other people's Netflix page is that the thumbnails, those little images that they show to preview the movies and the series, it's very different. Each user sees a slightly modified version of that thumbnail, and even the same user can see different types of that thumbnail throughout the day and throughout different points of interaction. So this is an example of automating not just what to show, but how to show, which visuals to use, what text to use. And you can think of, let's say, digital advertising and the possibilities there. If you figure out not just what audience to target, but how to really target it in the most efficient way, that's awesome, right? Because you're not just being relevant, but you really make them make them feel like you know the right information about them. Here, although it's important to both be cautious and just respect privacy and dignity, because it's easy to start being shady and to start being scary. I think many of us had moments when we see some advertisement on YouTube and Facebook and we think, oh, do I see this advertisement because I had this conversation in real life yesterday? Is it listening to me? And most of the time, at least from what we know, it's actually not the case. So when that happens, it's just because, let's say, you had a conversation with someone and then you texted them later that evening about something completely different, but Facebook just notes, oh, you've just interacted with that person. Maybe, their preference from yesterday will be relevant to you as well. And that's why it shows it to you. And as a user, right, this chain of logic that it's used some kind of collaborative filtering, blah, 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 that's not how I'm going to think about it. I'm going to think, oh, I had this conversation yesterday. It's listening in on me. Oh, my God, I'm so mad at Facebook. And the same can happen here. So it's very important to both be cautious and I think transparent and explicit with your users. So if you're doing things like that, just don't be yeah, don't try to hide how you're doing. If they want to know, and if you see that there is value and or not even value, but there's interest from the user side to know how it's working, then just go for it. Just be transparent. And I think the example with Facebook is a good one because personally, I hear very often from people around me that they're scared that Facebook is listening in on them. And from what I understood, I tried to research this a little bit, they're not. But then it's a really big mistake on Facebook's side not to be transparent about it. Maybe because they don't want to share other types of information that they know, or they just see that most of the people don't even realize that they are being tracked. But I think moving forward, this is not going to be the norm. The norm is going to be transparency and explaining how do you work and why do you show what you show. So this is the stage where you move when you are ready to, yeah, automate, let's say marketing, but also just when you are ready to utilize a lot of resources on these kind of endeavors. But hopefully these all of these examples will be also simplified and democratized even more. I see a lot of startups working in this field, and I think many different businesses and customers can benefit from this kind of personalization. Thanks a lot. That's it for me.